Before we get into the presentation, I thought it'd be nice to give a little bit of an introduction to our speaker, who is so kind to spend his time with us tonight, Clement Kent. Clement is an adjunct professor of biology at York University and is the author of How to Make a Pollinator Garden, which is an in-depth publication describing the steps, problems, and solutions to building a beautiful pollinator garden using native plants. Obviously, the focus of tonight's talk. Clement is a co-founder of Project Swallowtail, a program to help people create pollinator gardens, which has over 800 participants in the GTA and elsewhere. Keeping himself very busy, he's also a co-founder of the Parkdale Horticultural Society and is part of the advisory group for the City of Toronto's pollinator protection strategy. He's focused really heavily on building corridors of native plantings to connect larger green spaces for the benefits of pollinators. And I think he'll be able to share with us a wealth of very useful information. Before I hand the stage over to Clement, I thought it would also be nice to kind of see where everyone's joining us from. We had a little bit of that in the beginning, but for those of us who didn't get a chance to kind of participate, please in the chat, just briefly shout out where you are coming in from, where you're joining us from. It's kind of very interesting to see how far this webinar messaging went, how far our audience is coming from. And then we'll take a look at the chat. I tried to create a poll for this, but it didn't work out so well. Oh, we got Vancouver, Montreal, Oshawa, Michigan, Ohio, Orangeville, Peachland, BC, North Carolina, Newfoundland, Fayetteville, North Carolina. Wow, we have quite an audience. This is impressive. Florida, Brampton, my old stomping grounds, Milwaukee, Toronto. Thank you everyone for writing all. Costa Rica, I'm jealous. Garden State, New Jersey, Treaties 13, Territory, Hamilton, Mount Holly, North Carolina, Nova Scotia, St. Mary's University, if anybody knows, Kitchener, Waterloo. Wow. Bridgewater, Dundas, Ontario, Anishinaabe lands, Annandale, Virginia, and please forgive me if I'm messing up pronunciation. I'm learning a lot of things tonight. Thank you guys, that's amazing. It's a very varied audience. Thanks for coming together tonight and showing up for this wonderful talk. You can feel free to keep on updating the chat. I will also launch a poll question to determine what you're hoping to get out of tonight, whether or not you plan to use this information to create your own pollinator garden. So on the screen, you'll see a question. Are you planning on creating a pollinator garden in the near future? Yes or no? We'll wait like a minute and I will share the results on screen just to see where everyone's sitting on this. Excellent. People are answering fast and furious. I think that's good. I'll give you guys 10 more seconds and then I'll close the poll. 3, 2, 1, ending poll. And we'll share the results. And a whopping 97% of you will use this information to create your own pollinator gardens. That's amazing. That's really insightful. And for the remaining 3%, you're expanding your knowledge base. So excellent. And with that, I will hand the screen over to Clement. Clement, it is all yours.
Okay, thank you. And I'm delighted to be talking to so many people who want to make their own pollinator garden. And we are now going to get all excited here, and I'll see if I can do this right. Are we seeing my first slide?
Yes, it looks beautiful, Clement, just the way you want.
Okay, and I just have to drag something else down on my screen. There we go. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about making a pollinator garden. I've been talking about this for more than 12 years, and I've already done quite a bit of other work on it. So I'm going to talk about some of the problems that you can run into with this. I've got basic instructions, as I can't remember what Natasha Ali mentioned it, and those basic instructions are in this little book, which is out there on the web as a PDF. It's, I wouldn't call it in-depth. It's 32 pages long, and it's in a booklet format, but it's a good starting point. And there are members of the North American Native Plant Society, like Lorraine Johnson, who've written much more detailed and in-depth books that you can find. But today, I'm going to talk about the experience of the last roughly 12 years in terms of the problems that we hit. And those problems can be quite various. It's lots of fun, but we've run into some real challenges. So I'm going to show you what some of those problems are, how we've overcome them in the past. And I have to say, to begin with, that for those of you just doing it in your backyard, this is going to be starting off with some of the issues of public space. I'm going to get to things that relate to your backyard, and I'll show you some plants, but I'm going to suggest that you look at some of the other sources too. So this is more oriented towards people who are doing front yard pollinator gardening or working on public land. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is the problem, if you're using public land, of getting permissions in a timely way, which is, depending on where you live, sometimes strikingly difficult and sometimes amazingly easy. Most of us are not money bags. And I'll give an example of a garden where we had to work on a budget that was much smaller than we had hoped for, given the size of the garden. And I'm going to talk about climate change. I noticed that we had people there from Australia and the southern US and the West Coast, and you've all had some interesting and sometimes nasty experiences of climate change. In this area, the Great Lakes area, we've had some pretty good droughts and heat waves, nothing compared to what some of the rest of you have, but it's something we all have to take into account, and it's going to happen more in the future. We have to talk about maintenance, because if it's just your own garden and you're already an accomplished gardener, fine. Yeah, I don't really need to talk to you about that. You'll know already with things. But if you, the bigger the space you take on, the more people you share it with, the more maintenance problems you have. And so we're going to look at how to deal with some of those. And one of the important things that has to do with even people's front yards is that many municipalities claim the right in their bylaws to regulate what you do with your front yard. In fact, there are a few out there that might even attack you about what your backyard contains. So we've seen cases here in Canada and in the US, probably elsewhere, where somebody makes a complaint. There's a weeds bylaw that says, oh, you can't have these plants, or they can't be taller than this thing. And sometimes nasty stuff happens. So this is what was left of a lush front yard garden in London, Ontario, after the owner went on vacation, and one of her neighbors contacted the bylaw officer, who came in and got it mowed down. So we want to avoid that, and we want to change the worldview of the towns, municipalities, cities, rural areas that we live in so that that won't happen in the future. And I'm not going to forget to talk about the plants, but this is not a plantless talk. Contact me some other time and we can talk about, plants, but because you come from so many different areas, there are different sets of plants depending on where you are. And so I'll be showing you plants that grow well in Southern Ontario. They'll all grow well in most of the US Northeast, but they're not necessarily plants for Arizona or Western Australia or Florida. So let's talk quickly about permission. And for permission, planning is the key. And I have to say, I'm an impulsive person, and I've tried this several times in the past. I see a space, I said, let's just do it. And there's a wonderful positive energy when you find a couple of people and they're all saying, let's just do it. And if it's in your own yard, then you don't need anybody's permission and you can just get started. Or there's the other case, which I've had to deal with and other people have had to deal with, where it can take days or months or even years to get permission. So how do you get permission? And I've had to learn this the hard way, that this is something where you really want to start off contacting the government structure that makes the rules about the space. So if it was just your front yard, the only thing you might need to know is, do they have a height limit in their bylaws? But if you want to take a good chunk of, we've worked on parks land, we've tried to work unsuccessfully on school board land because our local school board is not very flexible on this. Whichever public body controls the land, try and get in touch with somebody who's an elected official or who works for an elected official first, because you can talk a nice talk. I've got a picture of my city councilor up on the screen. You can talk to them and you say how nice this is going to be for the kids in the area, how you're going to do this and that for the neighbors. They won't say yes or no. But if they say, well, that's a great idea, they haven't committed themselves yet. But then you can repeat that. When you hit the bureaucrats, you say, I talked to my counselor and she said it was a great idea. And that actually helps things move along. Now, in Toronto, we have an official pollinator protection strategy. And so the clip on the right of the screen is from their online pollinator protection strategy. But that's the strategy for the city. And it has its own department that deals with it. But if I wanted to do something on city roads lands, like roadsides, that's a different department within the city than if I want to do it on city park land or in a school board. So the next step, once you figure out who controls the land, is to find out who is the actual person that looks at applications for the use of the land. And sometimes that's really easy, especially if you live in a small town. But if you live in a big city, it can take a while to find out who is responsible. Now, I'll give you two examples of this. The first example we started in 2018, and a longtime member, former president of our society, had died unexpectedly, and we wanted to do a nice memorial to her. So we got in touch with the city. We were directed to the gentleman in the center of the picture on the left, Brian Green, who at that time was the supervisor for some parks in our area. He said, oh, there's this spot. And we looked at it under 6 inches of snow. We tried to imagine what it would be like. And Brian was happy with the results. He helped to guide us through the process. And there I am standing next to the garden in, that looks to me like maybe July of 2018. So we made rapid progress. On the other hand, there's the worst case. So we were approached in March of 2019 by a group called Friends of, I'm not going to tell you the name because it might embarrass somebody, Park. And a lot of them were parents whose kids played in this playground, which was in a city park. And they thought, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have a nice garden there? In our city, like many of yours, the expenditures on maintenance of public places, especially flower beds, have been cut back because, gee, we had to spend money on COVID or this or that. But I knew the ropes by then, and we followed the procedures, and we met brick wall after brick wall and brick wall. And finally, in March 2022, 4 years later, we got permission. And we're just talking about the little strip that's covered in dirty white snow here. But boy, it took forever to get permission to use that land. Now, one of our mistakes was we thought, well, this is part of a park. So we talked to the Parks Department, and for completely extraneous reasons having to do with reorgs and other things, it went from very slow to being impossible to deal with a park. And this was, like frustrating, because doing that other garden that I showed you, we were dealing with the Parks Department and getting great results. But it was the particular people in that area who couldn't deal with us. Eventually, a clever person in the Friends of No Name Park noticed that the land we were looking at was actually in the city road allowance. So although it was shown on the maps as being part of the park, it was technically governed by the City Roads and Transportation Department. And they contacted them, and it was like, oh, clear sailing, no problem. We got the approval so fast you could barely blink. So we submitted them a little plan like this, said it would be 80 feet long between the sidewalk and the fence in this area. And they said, great, we won't have to mow it, and you'll take care of it. And everything was fine. Now, if you have problems, the best people to go to are fellow gardeners and conservationists. Talk to them, especially the people in your area. If they've already done projects, they'll know who some of these people are. They'll know what some of the rules are. They're invaluable as sources of information. Once you've chosen your parcel and you think you can get permission because you've contacted the bureaucrats involved, then start making a plan. So here's us meeting in my house in midwinter, trying to get a plan together. And the most important thing for the plan is a good drawing, because it shows the bureaucrats that you're serious, and it allows them to envisage what you'd be doing. You need a drawing. And so find somebody with the skills to put it on. You can usually download, at worst, a Google Street View of the area involved. And you don't have to do this for your front yard. This is more if you're using the public space. And once you've got your plan, then write down some gushing prose, just a paragraph or two about how good it's going to be for your community. A less gushing paragraph about how you're going to meet all the rules, and submit it to whoever is going to give you the permission. And then you have to contact them. In our area, after 3 years of COVID and government cutbacks and so on, we ran into cases where, we'd send something to somebody and there'd be no answer for months. So you can't bug these people. They're usually legitimately busy, but you can let them know that you're there and that you're listening and you want to hear from them. And then if you have an unreasonable delay, go back to that counselor or reeve or whatever that you first talked to and say, I'm having an unreasonable delay here. Can you help me? And they pay much more attention if the counselor's office contacts them. Now that was all about getting access to the land, but you're going to need some money for plants and whatnot. So then you start writing grant applications. But in a grant application, typically the grantor wants to know that you have a plan, so you've got a drawing, and that you've talked to the authorities. And so you can write a grant application that says the plan has been submitted to such and such department, and you can put the grant application in, and you can start trying to budget, which is the next section. So for this garden here, we had originally put in a proposal that said it would be 80 feet long and 2.5 feet wide. And so it wasn't going to take up the whole width, and it was worked out to be about 250 square feet. And then when we talked to the city, there was like, take it all. To the city roads department, they said, take it all. So all of a sudden we had 160 foot, almost 7 foot wide space to fill. But we'd applied for grants based on less than half of that area. So we really had to make our money stretch. So the next part is about how to make your money stretch. Now, in our town, the people who take care of dead trees or trimming branches that have fallen down, whether you call them arborists or tree specialists, whatever, they usually have to pay to dump their wood chips somewhere. They don't want you to know that, and a lot of them will try and charge you for them. But if you phone around, you might find that there's somebody who's willing to give you wood chips for mulch for free. And that's what we got. We got a full truckload of wood chips. That saved us a couple $100. We then said, oh dear, all those lovely native shrubs we were going to put in that Colleen Cirillo is going to talk to you about in one of the next talks. Well, we just can't afford them all, so we canceled half of them. And when the plants began to be displayed outside grocery stores, I went and talked to the store managers, and I said, I'll take whole flats of these, and can you give me a bit of a discount? And they don't have a lot of flexibility, but I got a 10 or 15% discount. That was lovely. And we talked to some hardware store owners that knew a lot of the people from the area, and we got some things like hoses and a bit of equipment donated. So there's a lot of goodwill out there if you go out and look for it. Now, this picture shows a bunch of native plant growers in Ontario. And of course, that's not going to work for North Carolina or Australia or whatever, but there are lists of these people online. I'm sure you can find them. And just getting you used to our weather pattern, April 1st is kind of the point where it stops snowing and starts turning into mud here. So we got what are called plug trays. They typically have 50 or 100 little conical indentations in the plastic tray that plants were grown in last year or over the winter. But because you're getting little plants, you're spending much less per plant on them. So we got those trays, and then we transplanted them into pots with soil 7 weeks before planting. So they were sitting around on our back decks and taking advantage of the spring weather. And as a result, we got good sized plants for planting for way less than half of what we would have paid for them direct. Even better, if you have enough lead time, contact some of these growers the year before and say, I could make you a firm offer for this many plants of this type. What kind of price can you offer me? And I could maybe pay you half up front and half on delivery. And a lot of them will give you a bit better price if they know they're going to be able to sell it, because, you know, it's not always easy guessing where the market's going to go. And you can rely on seed sitters. I'm a seed sitter. I'm going to tell you all about seed sitters in a moment, but there's a table on my back deck full of pots of things that I grew from seed and then put into various gardens. So that's a fun thing to do if you're a gardener. And as we heard at the beginning, you've got sources of seeds like the NAMPS Seed Exchange. And so in the project that I co-founded with a bunch of other conservationists, which is called Project Swallowtail, we decided to create a seed sitter program. And GTA stands for Greater Toronto Area. We have about 1,000 gardeners around the Toronto area who've signed up to help create pollinator gardens or to improve other spaces in their neighborhood. And we've put videos online about how to care for your seeds, how to pot up the seedlings, and how to plant them. Now, we supply people, if they say that they want to be a seed sitter, with seeds, with soil in trays, with little chicken wire caps over them so that the squirrels don't dig up all the seeds. And we tell them how to, put them in a corner of their yard and leave them out during the winter, because most native plants in our area need exposure to winter weather before they'll sprout in the spring. If you're in a hot desert area, they might need something different, like some smoke or burnt vegetation salts. There's a lot of variation on this, but in much of northern North America, we need to do this kind of pre-stratification of the seeds. Our timeline for that, obviously, is we had to be thinking ahead. And so people would come and get their trays and their seeds in the fall. And we've now switched it to they can come to us as late as January, because that still gives them enough time for breaking dormancy with the seeds. They get the seedlings in May 1st, and many of them have never done this before. So we have to budget a lot of time from our more experienced gardeners to go and help them identify which is a seedling and that you intended and which is something that blew in, and to show people how to transplant, because these seedlings will be small. And what we want to do is, again, that 4 to 6 weeks transplanted into a pot, then they'll be big enough for us to put into our gardens. And we have videos online on YouTube. And if people participate in this, then our cost to stock a pollinator garden is pennies on the dollar. Now, this slide has got a bunch of links on it. And you don't have to copy them all down right away, because I think Ali is going to put them into the chat so you can get them. But notice that the first 1, 2, 3, 4 are from the North American Native Plant Society website. And the fifth one down there, the commercial growers, is a listing for North America of commercial growers of native plants. And I'm sure NAMPS didn't find every possible one, but they've got some good places to start. And of course, if you're a NAMPS member and you want that listing to get bigger, contact NAMPS and tell them about this great local grower in Tennessee or Arkansas who should be on that list. And at the bottom is a link to our pollinator partnership, Project Swallowtail links. So if you want to go ahead and grow plants from seed, these are some great resources for you. Well, now that you've budgeted for plants and ordered some in, and the truck arrives, and you've got all these plants to plant, what are you going to do now? I still didn't have enough plants when the size of that bed more than doubled. And so I went to my Home Depot store, and I found that they had packages of 30 Camassia bulbs or 30 Liatris corms for about $10 Canadian, it's probably about $7.50 in the US each. And that was like way cheaper than I could buy from any nursery. And I put those into the garden and they just did beautifully. So that's about 33 cents, maybe a quarter American per bulb. Plug plants in those trays are about $1.50 to $2 each. And as we increase awareness of pollinator gardening, some cities have begun to have giveaways, and some garden clubs will have giveaways. So keep your eyes open. And finally, use your garden and your neighbors' gardens. Divide, divide, divide. If you're planting your pollinator garden in the spring, you can gently separate daughter plants from other plants in established gardens. So at the bottom of the picture are some shooting stars, dodecatheon, growing in my wet garden. And I know that if I go out in April, I'll find 5 to 10 daughter plants going around each mother plant. And you take up the whole clump, very gently pull the daughter plants off, replant it all right away. And if you do that early in the spring, they will probably reach blooming size the next year. And you've gotten, half a dozen plants for free from every plant you already had. So almost done budgeting, but now we come to the evil part. You've produced a beautiful big garden and you'd like people to be able to enjoy it. Well, we had our budget. We had a budget for plants and for a little bit of equipment, but then we decided that we wanted to put in some benches so people could sit and enjoy the garden. And in this one garden, we did put in 2 benches, but because it was in a city park, that had to be through a process that the city controlled, and the city wanted a very substantial amount of money for these benches, and they had to do the installation. So we actually ended up asking our members if anybody could come forward with extra money to support the benches, and 2 kind people did, and we were able to fund them that way. But hardware is usually the most expensive part of one of these projects if you're going to need it. Here's another form of hardware, which is fencing. We've done a number of public place gardens. Some of them are savaged by kids who chase their balls in, dogs that run through it. Others are just fine. A lot of it depends on quirks of the locality. But if you have to put up fencing, even cheap temporary fencing, it can be more expensive than your plants as well. So in this picture, that long, thin garden, we got these short wire covered in green plastic fence materials and posts and put it in because that's a very heavily used sidewalk with lots of kids running by to get to the playground. We needed to protect it a bit. On the other hand, we did a garden in a place that those of you who are from Toronto might recognize. It's called High Park. And the city park staff there kindly made a raised bed around a couple of existing redbud trees. And there's huge amounts of lawn, mowed lawn area around it. And somehow the fact that it's raised and that there was plenty of lawn around it has kept most people from tromping in it. I had to kindly ask this lady who was tromping through it, gathering seeds because she wanted to grow them on her balcony, to not step on the plants. But for the most part, that garden has done well with no hardware whatsoever. So it's very dependent on the location and the people traffic. Well, that was budgeting. Now let's talk about climate. In the chart that you're seeing, which is for the year that one of our gardens got badly affected, the top red or orange line is the actual high temperature in July, and the dashed orange or red line underneath it is the average long-term temperature there. And that's in centigrade degrees. So for those of you Americans who are not used to it, 10 degrees centigrade is about almost 20 degrees Fahrenheit. So temperatures in that July were, in some cases, 10 degrees centigrade or almost 20 degrees Fahrenheit higher than the long-term average. And that was true at night as well. And when you have a bunch of young plants in, they really suffer. It's true that native plants get their roots down deep eventually, and then you don't need to water them. And I've got lots of experience with that. But that's eventually. When you get them, they're little. Even if they're in a pot, their roots only go a few inches deep. So when we get out of control weather like this, you have to make provision for watering. And I would say you need to plan on being able to water for 2, or in exceptional summers, 3 months to get the plants established. Now this picture, it's a map. Some of you might recognize southwestern Ontario. There's Buffalo on the lower right. The heavy red line shows where one native tree, tulip tree, reached its northern limits in 1915. And I actually have a 1915 forestry atlas of Ontario that showed me these locations. So that was a tree that just couldn't grow as far north as Toronto in 1915. It had been present along the shores of Lake Erie for centuries, but that was its northern limit. The orange line near the top is where tulip trees will now grow quite well, and the blue star marks the country property of a friend who's at a fairly elevated property right near the northern end of this range, and she's got 3 tulip trees in her garden, and they're growing just fine. So the tulip tree is an example of a plant that has moved almost entirely one climate zone to the north in terms of its ability to grow. And this is something we have to deal with when we're planting the garden, even if it's just your home garden. Some of you, if you're in Arizona or California, you're going to be charged a lot of money for your water. So you really don't want to be watering your plants much once they're established. So what you're going to have to do as you're planning your garden is to think about plants that are going to be able to tolerate our changing climatic conditions. And so I'm going to say, think about the plants that in the books you get from the library are listed as good for one climate zone south, or in Australia, north of where we are. Because as we get hotter, you're going to need plants with that tolerance to the heat. There's our garden after we first planted it, and notice the difference in bloom between the far half and the near half. The near half had more tree root competition, and so the problems with watering were intense. And on the farther half, there was less tree root competition and things established faster. So I found ways to water, not this one, although I often wished I had something like this, but I did get water in, and by August of that year, the plants were able to survive. And they throve. This is a plant called butterfly milkweed, or swamp, well, actually it's called swamp milkweed, sorry, butterfly milkweed's a separate one. But it attracted some interesting bumblebees quite quickly when it started blooming. The bumblebees were visiting a number of other plants in the garden, and we had monarch butterflies coming in too. So even in this very downtown, middle of downtown Toronto garden, we got lots of interesting pollinators. And one of the things we've been really aiming for, and I was very pleased to see happen, is there are a lot of families who live in apartments there. And you could see the moms at pushing the little kids in their strollers in the morning when we were working on the garden. And several of them stopped and said, "Thank you for making this garden. Our children have never seen wildflowers before." So native plant lovers, think about that. People living in cities are way more than half of our population these days, and many of the kids have never seen wildflowers. So we're doing a public service for the pollinators, but also for the kids. And here's our garden developing fairly nicely. And in the front of this picture, you can see some of those liatris bulbs that I got, 30 in a bag from Home Depot for $10. And they pop up, they bloom the same year, but then they multiply very nicely. So where you have one bulb one year, if it's in a spot that it likes, you might have 5 or 6 spikes next year. So as I've said before, these days, climate is changing. We need to plant our garden beds for tolerance of excessive heat, or what we think of as excessive heat now. You know, if you live in Tennessee, your idea of excessive heat is probably 10 or 20 degrees higher than mine, but still, one way or another, you have to choose plants that will tolerate these new warmer temperatures. You need to select them for drought resistance, unless you're lucky enough to be planting in a place that's got a native water supply. I worked as a bee biologist, and most bees nest in the ground, and they like bare ground. And so I've made the mistake of keeping a lot of the ground bare to encourage bees to nest. But you know what? It dries up so rapidly. So I've switched to encouraging heavy mulching. And this slide came from a talk I did on climate change and native gardening, in which I talked about forest fire risks, something an unpleasantly large number of us may have had to deal with. And I had somebody suggesting that we plant a belt of evergreen trees, you know, on the northwest side to break the wind. And I said, no, you know, if a fire starts in a drought, evergreens burn like crazy. If you have to plant trees, plant deciduous trees. I mean, unless the evergreens are the only thing that lives in your climate. Maintenance is such a big issue. Everybody has lots of energy and enthusiasm the first year of a garden. But in the second and later years, you're confronted with neighbors who want the garden to look like this man's head, all smooth and neat with nice empty soil spaces between the plants and so on. And they will complain if it looks like a natural meadow. Be sure of it. That we are currently, you know, in the midst of a many generations long struggle between the neat freaks and the people who appreciate nature. So you have to find a way to keep the garden looking pleasant. And one of the things that will really mess you up is if the invasives invade, as they tend to do. You really have to get your maintenance team in place, because a dig in time saves 99. But it's hard to get people out in hot summer days to weed. So you should put money in your budget for some snacks for the maintenance crew, and work on making the get-togethers at the park social occasions. Even if that's just your yard that you're talking about, think of inviting a friend over to talk with you while you work in the garden, because it makes the time fly by very nicely. Well, invasives that invade, some of them are way worse than others. So the picture here is a plant whose Latin name is Cirsium arvense, and the correct English name for it is Asian thistle. But if you look online, you'll often see it called Canada thistle. No, it's not. It's not from Canada, it's from Eurasia. And this suckers. It sends out roots under the ground, and where you see one little clump at the surface, next year you're going to have anywhere from 5 to a dozen clumps nearby. So this is one of those dig in time saves 99. You need to work to recognize the invasives that are really nasty and that need a shovel. And in our garden, in this park, we had bindweed, dog strangling vine, and these Asian thistles, and we had to dig and dig and dig to get them out. Spring is the very best time to get rid of them if you can do it. But the very best way of all to keep the invasives out is to cover all the ground surface with beautiful native plants. And so this is a picture of that long, thin garden in its first summer, and it has some of these native plants blooming happily away and getting ready to spread. That's not a complete list there, but you can see some of them that are for full sun, sun and part sun, partial shade and full shade. All of those are great investments, because if you put a couple of plants in, a year or two later, you'll be able to divide them and spread them out and saturate the space. So I'll give you one example of this. This is one of our native strawberries, Fragaria virginiana. Has beautiful little white flowers, develops luscious but small fruit. And in the lower right, you can see it doing what it does best. It sends out runners. And when they take root, a new plant will grow next year. And you could dig those up and gently move them around and eventually cover lots of space in the garden. So if most of the soil is covered with the plants you want, then they'll help shade out the seedlings of the plants you don't want. And because we were doing this one next to a kid's playground, we put a number of native plants that have edible fruit in as part of the attraction. So mulches, let me talk a little bit more about mulches. Mulches are a recurring job if you choose to protect the soil with them. At the beginning, we did what's called lasagna gardening. We had, just ordinary lawn that was full of weeds and been mown for many years. So we put down brown, they call it sometimes craft paper, in several layers over that. And then we put 3 to 4 inches of wood chips over the top of it. And the grass and the other weeds die off underneath that paper. And eventually they will break down, the paper breaks down, and you have good soil with not too many weeds. If you don't have wood chips, leaves or pine needles are great. And I've done gardens, and this is sort of for the rock gardeners amongst you, where you can use coarse sand or fine gravel as a mulch. It's a completely different look. You maybe want to make sure it fits into the feel of the location, but it's really easy to pull weeds out of sand, even if the soil underneath is not sandy. It needs to be thick enough. And if you use something that breaks down like leaves or wood chips, you need to renew it every year. Hopefully less and less as your ground cover plants spread out. Now I'm getting to the part where you've done all this work, you've created a beautiful garden, and the city comes and whacks it down. This is really sad. I saw Lorraine Johnson on the list of attendees, and she can tell you about many, many, many sad stories where people have had their native plant gardens whacked because of bylaws. And she wrote this piece in the Toronto Star titled "When Grass and Weed Bylaws Are Weaponized Against Habitat and Biodiversity." But if we look at this picture that accompanied the article, on the right, we can see a native plant garden for the house on the right, and next to it, the lawn of the house on the left. If the person in the house on the left is a neat freak and hates things leaning over or running into their lawn, they may call up the bylaw officer, or maybe somebody 3 houses down will do it. You need to convert your neighbors. Part of our job as native plant gardeners is to spread the word. This is like a cult. We're part of a native plant cult. We need to do it because most people are raised with the view that a garden, if you're going to have one rather than a beautiful flat lawn, should look totally neat and tidy. It should look like you went out and hoed it every day. You have to give people reasons to enjoy a more natural look. So bring them over, talk to them, show them the flowers, show them the pollinators coming in, give them some cut flowers, or if you've got some fruit in there, give them some fruit from your garden. If they have children or grandchildren, bring them over and show them all the cute bugs or birds in the garden. Convert your neighbors so that they won't call the bylaw officer. Well, that's one approach, but sometimes it still happens. So bylaws are changing. Lots of people like Lorraine and many others in NAMPS have been working very hard over many years, at least 20 years, to get the official attitudes towards natural gardens to change. And in this slide, the little green box at the upper left, you don't need to read all the little words in it, but it's from 2015. And this is from a City of Toronto website. And next to a playground, there was an area where lots of little native bees that nest in the ground were emerging. And so people called up the park supervisor saying, can you exterminate them? They might harm our children. But because the city staff had recently been trained on pollinators, they were able to identify the bees as so-called tickle bees that do not sting. And they talked to the school children and installed educational signage. Everybody was thrilled to have tickle bees, and no one was threatened anymore. So that's 2015. The white box at the lower left was a report that the City of Toronto brought out in response to requests from its councillors for, what should we do about this conflict? And they put together a pollinator protection strategy. And that went eventually to City Council. People voted on it and it became the law. And we now have, big picture on the right, an official Toronto pollinator protection strategy. And it's been rolled out to all the departments of the city so that the bylaw officers, the parks people, the roads people all know about the strategy. It takes time to change people's attitudes, and this one is changing. So we took the space on the left, and 4 years later, we got permission, and in one season, we turned it into the space on the right. It's doable. Don't get discouraged. We got a school class to come in and help water and plant some plants. And a while later, I was looking at monarchs on some of those swamp milkweeds, and we had a kid who came over and said, I planted that plant. Boy, that's great. That's the age group I want to reach with the native plant gospel. And here's the garden, looking pretty satisfying in its first year. So with that, I'd like to thank all the people who helped, my Horticultural Society, Parkdale, Landscape Ontario, the landscapers official organization, donated money, the Toronto Parks Department and people in City Hall, some anonymous donors, people who gave plants, World Wildlife Fund Canada. They all helped us do some of these things. It's popular, you know it, because you're here, interested in it, you can do it too. So thanks. I'd like to answer your questions.
Clement, that was amazing and so informative. We've had the chat blowing up with a couple of questions. So Ali, I'll leave it over to you to lead the way.
Sure. A couple I grabbed were for winter stratification, should the tray of seeds be covered with anything other than chicken wire? Perhaps a plastic tray over top to create a greenhouse effect? Question mark.
It doesn't have to be. One of our most experienced people, Pete Ewens, who has talked to the NAMS and has stuff up on their website too, he will put it on the ground and put some leaves over the top of the chicken wire. That's great because it keeps it moist, or you could put a plastic top over. The only problem will be at the beginning of spring when the slugs get active on a warm day and they're crawling around underneath that nice cover and they eat all your seedlings. So if you cover it, make sure you take the cover off when, a week or two before sprouting time happens.
Now, another one, did your Home Depot really have true native bulbs or corms versus cultivars?
They are probably nativars in the sense that the Liatris was probably a Liatris spicata. It probably didn't follow the same, grown from seed collected within 100 miles of the location that we do with our seed sitters. But sometimes when you need to fill a space up and you don't have much budget, starting with a native R rather than a pure native is a good compromise as far as I'm concerned.
Those were the only two I saw in the chat from earlier. Natasha, did you catch any others? Oh, there's another one here now.
Yeah, okay, we got it.
Okay, good. I'm going into my third session for my pollinator garden, but have little luck. A crepe myrtle had been removed, but stump left, putting off many shoots. Could this be affecting the soil since little is growing successfully? Can we save the garden?
Well, crepe myrtle and other trees, their roots can take a lot out of the soil. It's not that native plants need soil that's rich in nutrients, but they do need some moisture available somewhere. And so if they're competing with the tree for that moisture, that's going to be the issue. You might try mulching around it. You might try directing some water. In my garden, all of my downspouts are tied to rain barrels. And so I can put water on parts of my garden that are looking iffy without having to get it from the city water supply.
I have one earlier question that appears to be a question coming from Jane. Less expensive seed starting mediums, ideas. So I guess she's looking for ideas around mediums that can be used to start seeds that are fairly inexpensive.
Yeah, this is an area where we could have like a whole other hour talk about this, and it's controversial. Most of our soilless mixes, which are sterile, that you buy from the store, based predominantly on peat. And with climate change, we're trying to reduce our use of peat. You can find other sterile mixes, or you can make your own. It's usually a problem of two things. You want to get out the weed seeds, so you're not constantly pulling them out of your pot, and it can't be too dense. If you just take garden soil and put them into a pot, you'll usually find that it compacts. And so the trick with all these store-bought things is that they've added a lot of organic matter. In the case of the sterile mixes, that's peat, but it could be compost from your compost heap, if you're lucky enough to have a compost heap that gets hot enough to sterilize. Otherwise, you may want to try and sterilize it yourself. Don't cook it in the kitchen because it stinks as it's cooking. Maybe take it outside and pour some boiling water over it. So there are ways to do it. I use my compost in the bottom of the pots, and I put a thin layer of the sterile soil on top. That prevents the weed seeds underneath from sprouting. But when my plants get down there, they're getting their roots into compost and they're very happy.
Very helpful. There was some requests for suggestions on plants that would do well in heavy clear soils coming out of the Hamilton area. The audience was kind enough to kind of contribute to that. Just wondering if you had some other suggestions as well. Suggestions so far were Hydrophyllum virginianum, as well as, I think I lost it in a thread.
There are places, and I think this is something that NAMS and Evergreen has a native plant database online. You can find people who put databases online, and some of them you can put in filters like sun versus shade, wet versus dry, sandy versus clay. So rather than giving you specific plants, I'd like to suggest you find one of those sources of information and use it, because you might find a whole bunch of new things. Now, I gardened for a number of years in a garden with heavy clay soil. Yeah, bakes into brick. In midsummer, best thing is get your leaves and compost on top of it. It's not an immediate fix. I know that. Sorry. And then I have friends who garden on sandy soil and everything parches. Best solution Put your leaves and compost on top, and after a couple of years, the soil will retain more water. So the best solutions are to imitate nature, but maybe speed it up a bit by, instead of having a 1/4-inch layer of leaves, put on a 2-inch layer of leaves, and you'll maybe get 8 years worth of soil addition in one.
Thanks. Clement, has there been anyone talked about working with power companies to put pollinator gardens where power lines are? This is a question coming from Jane.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and there's some excellent examples out there. And I give a talk on pollinator corridors, and there's some wonderful examples of power companies taking areas under big transmission lines and switching them from just being mown to having native meadows on them. In Toronto, there's a huge project that goes across half the city under a set of power lines that for 60 years were mowed. But members of our local conservation authority worked really hard for 10 years. It took them 10 years to get the permissions and to raise the money to change it. And they're now doing a corridor that runs across half the city from a national park on the east end, right to the middle of the city, where they've got beautiful native meadows and playgrounds and bicycling paths and so on under the thing. In Vancouver, or actually Richmond, BC, there's another example of a power corridor where native plants were put in. I'm not as familiar with the United States, but I bet that of the people who are present here, you can put in lots of examples of this. I know that I think the Buffalo Niagara Falls area was working on something like that that's nearby, and maybe you'll give us some more examples in the chat. It's a wonderful thing to suggest to your power company, and to suggest to them that they will reduce their costs by not having to mow as often. The only thing is, you can't use shrubs or trees that get over a certain height, because they really don't want that.
Thanks, Clement. One earlier question. We have a question from Pat. I'm going to my 3rd session for my pollinator garden, but have had little luck.
Yeah.
A creep.
We answered that. Thank you.
Oh, I missed that. Sorry. Thank you.
I see one, Ali, from Margot M, which says natives can be very tall for cityscapes. Do you ever trim them to manage that? And the answer comes in yes. I have been experimenting with that, and it's partly because I converted the tree lawn in the front of my property into a native plant garden. And I put in a number of species that grow very tall. And we have a bylaw that says that they shouldn't be more than 18 inches tall if they're between the sidewalk and the road. So I've been experimenting with what in Britain is called the Chelsea chop. Okay, just remember that the Chelsea Garden Show is the most famous gardening event in Britain. And of course, the exhibitors always have to make sure they get the densest, luscious, most covered in bloom plants possible to take into the Chelsea Flower Show. So they know about how to trim them, often several months before flowering, to lower the height of the plant and get it to be more bushy. Now, you can do that with many, many native plants, not all of them. I do that with goldenrod, with Joe Pye weed, with ironweed. The ironweed in my garden would bloom at 8 feet tall, but I can get it down to 5 feet tall if I do the Chelsea chop 3 times on it. I have to do it once early in the season, one mid-season, and once just before the flower buds are starting to form. So it is possible to keep the heights down if you plant taller plants. You just have to keep at it.
Thanks. Next question. Are there easier North American native plants to start from seed over others?
It's going to depend entirely on your region. The beautiful flower Gallardia or Gallardia is found all over the prairie states and a little bit into the prairie provinces of Canada and down into some of the southwestern desert areas. There's a couple different species there. And of course, what most people see are horticultural varieties that have been bred. But in Toronto, there's an area which was re-landscaped into, it's under a large raised highway. It's called the Bentway. And they put some berms and large hills of soil in there, and they put native plants and native grasses in there. And they're not heavily mown. It's wonderful. There's Gallardia growing there, and it's coming back and blooming after its third or fourth year in that location. In High Park in Toronto, it's been put in by the High Park Nature Stewards, and it's blooming on a sandy hillside there. And it has very pretty little flowers, and it's very easy to grow from seed. So if you wanted to start with something like that, that's a good one. Now, purists might say that it doesn't grow in Ottawa. Well, that's true. It's not native to Ottawa. If you want to find stuff that's local to your area, again, I suggest you go back to those databases, because many of them will tell you whether it's easy to grow from seeds. Easy is also a bit of a tough question. How much gardening have you done before? If you've grown tomatoes or zinnias from seed, then you've got enough experience for most of these things. I try and get people to start purple coneflower if they're further south, or pale pink coneflower here, because they're both fairly easy from seed. Purple coneflower, the nativars will bloom the first year. Pale pink coneflower tends to take 2 years, so it takes a little more patience. There's lots of other ones like that. Nancy Nichols says she started cardinal flower, Joe Pye weed, swamp milkweed, blazing star. Yeah, I would say swamp milkweed should be on the list. Very easy to get going and very rewarding. So thanks, Nancy.
Here's an interesting one from Laura. I'm creating a pollinator garden amongst native cedars, tamaracks, and birches. Should I remove a lot of the surface roots since root competition shows, or maybe that slows growth of the native perennials? I thought root competition helped plants grow faster.
Well, you're going to have a high shade area unless you're planting on the south side of those trees. When I had that list of ground covers up, there were things in it like native ginger and some of the other plants that grow. And some of them are tolerant of year-round shade, like you would get under those evergreens. Others are tolerant of shade, except they need light in the springtime before the deciduous trees come out. For the roots, I'm not going to worry about the roots. I would never remove roots on those plants. I just, see if I could throw a bit of extra leaves in there to give the plants something to start. I'm seeing a number of questions about lime and ticks. I think the very best thing people are going to do, and if Lorraine is there, she's going to laugh. Lorraine was once known as the chicken lady. She appeared anonymously on city radio to promote the fact that she was growing chickens in her backyard. And now it's been made legal, so I can out her like this. A lot of poultry, guinea hens are supposed to be very good at this, are murder on ticks. They love to pick them off and eat them. So if you're in the kind of area where you could have a few fowl in your yard, that's one way to keep the ticks down. And I see Jeannie Hucko has said, yes, that works for her. If your yard is fenced, you might consider having, a chicken or a guinea hen or something like that in there. And you can look online and there will be people who tell you what's good for that. For the rest of the question, if you can't have livestock in your yard, the question about Lyme is one where, just like we want to change bylaws, could you please contact your health authorities and tell them to legalize the existing Lyme vaccine? I can buy a Lyme vaccine for my dog, but I can't legally get it as a human. It's quite effective. So I would say, the best way to deal with this is not to only have lawns because they have fewer ticks. It's to get the Lyme vaccine legal.
Clement, there was an earlier question in regards to tips for removing garlic mustard, especially when it's already past the 2-year mark.
Yeah, I have garlic mustard that self-seeded into my garden. And again, springtime is my best time. I find that after the soil is just unfrozen, the roots are relatively loose. The problem with pulling garlic mustard later in the season is that very often the roots just break off in the ground and the plant comes back. But in early spring, they come out roots and all. And then if I watch for seedlings, because there's always some seeds that you didn't get, and pull them out in their first year, they haven't grown that big root clump under the ground yet. So those are my 2 most successful strategies, and I've gradually gotten it under control. I still have to do weeding every year, but it's I see a comment from CL about planting milkweed 3 years ago, and now it's out of control. When I talk to people about milkweeds, I emphasize the fact that there are dozens of species of milkweeds. Even here in Canada, where we normally have less diversity, we have something like 12 different species of milkweed that are native to Ontario. And if you go further south, you've got even more species. The common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca, is what a lot of people plant, and it is a thug. It's like that thistle. It sends out runners underneath the ground and takes over your whole garden. I would never plant that plant in a small garden, because you're going to get just the problem that the person has talked about in the chat. Butterfly milkweed, swamp milkweed, and several others are not runners. And the monarch butterflies like them just enough. They're shorter, they've bloomed longer. So I think those are the ways to go.
We have another question earlier asking if native plants have the potential to damage grass lines.
To damage what?
Gas lines.
No. Well, not the perennials and grasses that we're talking about. And it's not usually gas lines that we worry about. It's usually sewers. There are some trees where the roots will go down and invade your sewer pipes, and then you have to call a roto-rooter to get them unblocked. In my city, maples are particularly notorious for doing that, but it's usually tree roots that are the issue.
Are there any recommendations for mugwort removal?
I'm going to throw that open to the rest of you. I don't know.
Any suggestions from the community? Feel free to place your responses in the chat to help Jasima. Allie, are you seeing any other questions throughout the chat that we've missed?
Yeah, I've got one here that says, I'm the principal of a Bee City school in the Interlake area of Manitoba. Is there any suggestions you would have for plants, etc., to put in our pollinator garden that can take flood in spring and almost drought in the summer/fall?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Thank you for that. But I'll call you the Eastern prairies. Manitoba is a much moister place than, parts of Alberta, and you have all kinds of really interesting plants that used to grow there. The native meadow plants of Manitoba are, much reduced, because when you break up those meadows, as European settlers did, breaking sod so that they could plant the wheat and so on, you lose a lot of those. But there are lots and lots of plants that can tolerate that. I would suggest talking to somebody. We've got a suggestion with striated, Indian, little blue stem, big blue stem. Most of those are grasses or other things. They're taller. You can do prairie crocus. There are a number of other plants. You actually have sort of more options if you've got a sunny, meadowy type space than will grow here in Ontario. So good luck on that. Ask NAPS for more information. I'm not a Manitoban, so I don't know as well as other members do. Oh, Japanese knotweed. Oh, boy, that's a monster. Constant cutting. The only way I know of. There's a lovely story from British Columbia. There is somebody there who has a herd of goats, which he rents out for getting rid of knotweed infestations. And what he does is he has electric collars on them, and he can sort of fence them into an area. If the knotweed sprouts are eaten often enough by the goats, eventually the big underground root system will be diminished. But that can take several years. The only way to get rid of it is just keep chopping the tops off. Just keep after it. And eventually it will give up. Now that works if it's all within your yard. The problem many of my friends have is that it's spread into somebody else's yard, and even if they take the shoots off, it's going to come back from the neighbor's yard. And that's an almost insoluble problem. You could get a nuclear bomb and set it off in your neighbor's yard.
So it's a battle of wills.
It's a tough problem.
Thank you, Clement. We do have one question as we're nearing our end time. It came up earlier on, we couldn't get to it, but it's come up again. Can you speak a little bit more about how you are now using mulch? I've heard it is not good for native plants, and it's good to see you.
So I use it different ways in different places. So I talked quite a bit about using it in these new pollinator gardens to help keep down the invasives and other weeds. In my established garden, I let the leaves that come out of the trees, I put them on top of the gardens, and in a few places I'll rake it a bit in the spring so that stuff that's coming up out of the ground and is weak can push through. The mulch, you can do several different ways. If you have your old stems from 2 years ago and you compost them a bit, you can then put that on as a mulch, and it'll be broken down enough that you're recycling. The main thing about that mulch is just getting something to protect the soil surface. In my garden, I used to have a lot of problems with slugs. And I recently visited a country property where there was a swimming pool and I was helping maintain it. And when I looked in those little catch basins that water's filtered through, I found them full of darkling beetles. And darkling beetle larvae are some of the most ferocious predators of slugs. So I got a bucket of darkling beetles and I brought them back to my city garden and I let them loose, and I put even more mulch in that area because their larvae like to live underneath the mulch and they eat the slugs. And gradually my slugs are reducing. So there's a lot of variations about how to use mulch. Those are some of the answers. Good
Thank you,
books,
Clement.
the soil.
That was excellent. This question came directly to me, but it was meant for you. And I think it will have to be probably our last question that we can take for the evening. Does it matter which trees are chipped for mulch? I'm concerned about getting diseases introduced with free mulch.
We had some trees where the trunks had been chipped, and you could see that because the wood was still green. And I was a little concerned about what might be growing out of that, because very often the bottom of a tree trunk is where you've got, the various issues. We had a wonderful display of various mushrooms coming up out of that wood mulch, but I didn't see any evidence of pathogenic things. I think that the main issues would be some of the invasive diseases could be spread by that. For instance, we have box, the hedging plant. It's native to Europe, but it's widely used in hedges here. And a fungus has come in from Europe that's native in that thing, but is now killing many box hedges. And they warn you, if you're trimming these back, you have to burn them or send them to the dump or something, because otherwise you'll spread the fungus. So there are cases where you can spread the fungus, but there's not too many of those. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. And somebody asked about mulch from black walnut. I'm not so sure about the wood. Most of the allelopathic poisons that walnuts secrete is from their roots. I don't have the experience about the bark. So so John Foster has said that it's the chemical called juglans. More of it comes from the roots, but I don't know how much comes from the leaves and the bark.
Thank you, Clement. That was an excellent presentation and a very informative evening for all. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us tonight, and like to take this moment to thank all the audience members that came out to listen to this talk. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed hosting it. Keep an eye out on the website. We will be making tonight's webinar available for viewing if you weren't able to attend, or you came late, or you just want to revisit this and learn some more. We'll also be having further webinars coming up in the upcoming months, so keep an eye out for that. And with that, we wish you all the best. Have a wonderful evening, stay safe and healthy, and see you next time.